You're listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Sean Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision-making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision-making in your life and business.
So I think my freaking phone got hacked, my number or something, because all of a sudden, this started happening like 2 weeks ago. All of a sudden, I get 3 to 4 texts a day of, those spam texts like, hey, would you like to have coffee today? And it's some number you've never heard of.
Yeah.
How about golf? Or, it's just these random things that they want.
Hey, Erica, how's it going?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I got one of those.
Yeah.
It said Erica.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Mm.
So the other one is I was getting these spam calls. It was calls I didn't recognize. And for some stupid reason, I would answer the call. And then there's nothing there. And then it would just hang up.
That's the one I don't understand.
I don't understand what their deal is there.
There.
Why are you not? You got me to answer. Now you're not going to do it. You're not going to capitalize on this. Having me on the phone. But I found a thing that Apple.
Fishing, not reeling.
Right. I found a thing that Apple lets you do on your phone, which I didn't know because I started Googling this. You can send any number that is not in your contact list straight to voicemail.
Oh.
Yeah. So go into your phone, go to settings, go to your phone, and just go down towards the bottom. And any number that's not on your contact list, straight to voicemail. It won't even ring. Yeah. So I did that. That helped. I'm still getting them, but it's not annoying. It's not buzzing my phone all the time now.
Yeah. Now you're one of those guys that are hard to get a hold of.
Well, I did find that anybody I interacted with, I'm like, oh, give me a call later. I'd have to make sure I put them in my phone.
Yeah. Otherwise, they're just going to the
Otherwise, it goes straight to voicemail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's better, though.
It is better.
It didn't stop the text, though.
Fixed it. I fixed the problem.
It didn't stop the text, though.
No, I don't know how to fix that. To do something with that.
Yeah, I don't know how to tie that one. The game is normally.
I beat you.
I find a way to tie this into the guest.
I don't know how you. Yeah.
I think you beat me on this.
I did. I rarely win this game.
Yeah. Well, did you like write down a list of the numbers?
No.
Say yes. Say yes.
Yeah, sure. I wrote them down.
Speaking of writing, that's horrible. Our guest today, Eric Weiner, is best-selling author and former international correspondent for NPR. He's known for his explorations into happiness, purpose, and what it means to live a meaningful life. He won the Peabody Award for his investigative journalism into the tobacco industry and how they use charitable contributions to kind of ingratiate themselves into the public and hide some of their wrongdoings. He's a very accomplished journalist, a well-traveled man, and very, very wise. So we talked about the travels that he's had to South Asia, what he's learned through that experience, what he learned during the investigative journalism work that won him the Peabody Award. And we talked about his newest ventures, writing books today, specifically his latest on Ben Franklin. I really enjoyed talking with Eric. I know that you'll learn something by sticking around. I'm Sanger Smith. I'm with my dad, Sean Smith, and this is Decidedly. Thanks for being here, Eric.
Hey, you're Sanger
Yes.
and you're Sean.
You had a 50%. You had a 50% shot on that one, and you got
There
it.
you go. I think that's the end of the episode. That's my decision-making philosophy. Flip a coin.
Flip a coin, and if you're right, then you got to walk away on a win.
There you go. No double or nothing.
Well, I was really excited to talk to you, Eric. I don't know how I'm going to talk to you about all the things I want to talk to you about the time we've got allocated, because you have such a broad experience of different things. I wanted to go back on something first and touch on it before I get to sort of the idea between places and ideas. and you had won a Peabody years ago on some investigating work that you had done on the tobacco industry. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the work you did around that and how it relates to what we're seeing now with the pharmaceutical industries.
Wow. That is going back a few years. If I recall, what I was investigating for NPR about the tobacco industry was how they used charitable donations and philanthropic funding, as say Philip Morris or companies like that, in order to ingratiate themselves to the public at large, and the sort of quandary that a lot of these recipients of their largesse were finding themselves in at museums and music companies and things like that. And, do we accept this money or not? My wife is president of a nonprofit organization. I know how hard it is for these nonprofits to exist, especially today. And it really put them in a bind. And then it gets to the question of how you separate do you take quote unquote dirty money or not? Pharmaceutical industry is not obviously the tobacco industry. They are in the business of making people better, not more addictive or sicker. But there's a dark side to big pharma as well, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just the translation of between what happened in the tobacco industry and how those eventually bought our food industry. And it's the same people, the same science of addiction that we now see in a lot of our food, a lot of our pharmaceuticals, that seems to be really well correlated.
I think that's a good analogy because I have friends who are medical doctors and who are, researchers into particularly these new classifications of drugs, Ozempic and Wegovy, and these weight loss drugs. And what's really fascinating is what they found is that not only people on the drugs, their appetite is reduced for food, but they find they engage in other compulsive behaviors less frequently. Gambling, online shopping, which I know I'm guilty of. So it suggests that our relationship to food is really not that different from our relationship to sort of compulsive shopping or other compulsive behaviors.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
this is like, the Red Bull skydiving team needs to stay far away from Ozempic. It's like the worst nightmare for a BMX motocross type.
Yeah, and I do wonder if I wonder if you just are really pepped up on too much Red Bull, you're going to be jittery and you're not going to be so good on the BMX or jumping out of an airplane at 100,000 feet.
Probably not.
But yeah.
So it's interesting that interplay between how that same kind of concept works and the deceptive practices that we saw earlier still happen in different industries. And I hadn't thought about what you were talking about on sort of how those industries ingratiate themselves with not only corporations, the philanthropic institutions, but our government, and that can sway how the public narrative is shaped because people don't want to go against their benefactor.
Exactly. It puts them in a bind. And it's an old story. I'm sure it goes back, if we traced it way before the tobacco industry. I mean, industries have been doing this for a long time. So it creates a situation where you're doing good, but perhaps what's funding your good is a quote unquote bad source. And I know there's a debate about this in the nonprofit world, where do you take money from? If you're, say, a journalism organization or a nonprofit helping journalists, would you take money from Facebook or X, previously Twitter, when really they're eating your lunch, these algorithms? Would you AI is having a big effect on journalism, most of it negative so far. Do you take money from an organization that ultimately does not have your best interest in heart in the long term, but in the short term, it gets you through the next business cycle?
How is AI having a negative impact on the journalism?
Well, what it's doing, and if you just go on your computer now and you ask a question or do a search, what's the first thing you see these days? You see an AI summary. Okay, if you say, I wonder what's going on in Ukraine, you will get an AI summary of the latest news developments of, the new announcement by the Biden administration or whatever it is, the latest from the battlefront. And chances are you'll never go to the source of that information, which might be the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, or, a local newspaper and local news site. So they're sort of bypassing the source of the material. And of course, those news sites want to get you into their homepage or at least into their website. So that's the big challenge right now.
Yeah, and how can that last for very long? Because if what they've created is a free product that allows me, the consumer, to bypass giving any attention, dollars, views, clicks to the source material, well, eventually the source material dies off, which is the source for the AI-generated summary and the film.
Right, because the AI without that source material and that huge library of information it's not I at all. It's not intelligent at all. Right. So that's a good point.
AI is not standing in the Gaza Strip.
I mean, and there are lots of examples in nature, right, of the parasite that ultimately kills its host. And I know there's a strong words, and I don't want to call the AI industry a parasite, but in this case, they are dependent on the host, which is news organizations and journalists, and just could be your podcast or whatever, to provide them with that raw material. And you're right, if they go under, certainly the model becomes less reliable because they've lost one or two, or they'll ultimately lose all of these sources.
One thing I've noted, or a suspicion that I have, is that some less reputable organizations are just straight up using AI to write articles, and usually about either articles that are maybe less popular, topics that are not as popular, or
you can tell that from just reading them?
To me, it seems that way because there'll be a lot of bullshit information in there that doesn't add anything. And this isn't like, I haven't noticed this at a company that we would recognize necessarily, like a Washington Post or NPR, New York Times. No, and I haven't noticed that. But if I go, I'm looking for an answer, hey, college football, all games wrapped up, what are the projections for who's going to be in conference championship weekend? And I go click on, some link on the first page of Google, and I'll read the article. The first two paragraphs will be sort of meaningful, and then it'll be like,
then it gets
to like Chat GPT stuff where it's like, what is the college football playoff? Or like, well, nobody who clicked through this article would need to know that.
College football is an American sport.
Yeah. It's sort of like, having a friend who's, drinks a little too much, but is very good at hiding it until they're not. It's like, it may take you like 10 minutes to realize that Joe's a little hammered, but Joe's been hammered for so long and is so good at masking it that you don't realize it right away. And that's one analogy. I mean, I have noticed, and the more arcane the subject, actually, there are fewer sources. So I wrote an article for the New York Times travel section about a specific travel topic. And I noticed when I put that keyword in, that it's awfully close, the summary, to the article I wrote for the New York Times travel section. And I think partly, listing the same examples of these kinds of places, I won't go into it now, but these kinds of places I was writing about, this category of places. And I think because there's less out there to draw upon, it's relying more heavily on that one source. And I wouldn't call it plagiarism quite, but I was like, they're getting that from my article, or they, there's no they. It's just a machine, an algorithm. But yeah, we're living in interesting times.
Was being a journalist something that you knew you wanted to do from a young age?
I didn't know what else I could do. I think like a lot of people end up going into careers sort of by, you know how doctors do a diagnosis by exclusion. You don't have this, you don't have that. So,
you knew what you couldn't do.
I knew what I couldn't do. I couldn't do math. I couldn't do science. Lots of things I couldn't do. But I could string together a sentence pretty well. And I know I loved to travel, and I had this, vast, really deep curiosity about the world. I mean, one of my first favorite toys or gifts was a shortwave radio, which, Sanger, you probably don't know what a shortwave radio is.
No.
Oh, no. But Sean, you probably do know what a shortwave radio is.
I do.
Yeah. See, this is a generational divide. Before the internet, there was AM, FM radio, and there was shortwave, which goes over much longer distances. So I'd be sitting in my apartment with my mom and my brother, in Baltimore, Maryland, and tuning into stations from Russia, from China. They have their English language broadcast service. So this is Radio China. This is Radio Moscow, coming from halfway around the world. And it was the closest thing to traveling that a 8-year-old from Baltimore could do. So I had that interest in the world. I could string together a sentence. And I had an unusual skill in that I had a pilot's license from a young age. I flew a plane by myself before I drove a car by myself at age 16. And true story is, a week after my solo flight in an airplane, I took the driving test and failed because of the parallel parking, which you don't have to parallel park a plane. So long story short, my first job out of college was at Flying Magazine, which was and still is the world's most widely read aviation magazine. And that was a lot of fun, writing about airplanes, mainly for private pilots, people like that, or aviation enthusiasts. And then I was off and running, but I knew I wanted to do more than writing about airplanes. I didn't want to be an airline pilot because, let's face it, you get on an airplane, right? And you don't want the pilot to come on and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's the captain speaking. I've been in a bit of a creative rut lately, so I'm going to mix it up today. So fasten your seatbelt, hang on, and here we go." So creativity, that is not what you're looking for.
Not a lot of room for creativity in piloting. Yeah.
No, I mean, you're looking for creative problem solving when one engine fails, but you're not looking for people who want to fly outside the box. And
definitely not artistic expression.
Yes, I had a much more artistic and creative streak. So working at Flying Magazine was as close to being a professional pilot as I would ever get.
I love looking at all the places to travel to, and your curiosity has taken you to a lot of different places. I just booked a trip, coincidentally, as we're talking, to India, Bhutan, and Nepal coming up in a few months.
Okay,
and
great.
I'm fascinated as to what took you there and what you thought you might find when you got there, because you spent quite a bit of time there.
Yeah, I lived in New Delhi for a few years. I go back there once a year. I go back to Nepal and Bhutan once a year as well. Look, I just dove into the deep end. So I went from Flying Magazine through a few other jobs and landed at NPR and was covering business and economics in Washington, D.C. And I loved working for NPR. I did not love covering business economics in D.C. I wanted to go overseas, and I kept bugging the foreign editor, a nice woman named Elizabeth, saying, "Elizabeth, I want to go somewhere." She's like, "We don't have any openings." Then one day I go in her office and she says, "Okay, how about Delhi? We want to open a bureau in New Delhi, India." And I just immediately said yes. I had never been to India. I knew very little about India. Didn't speak any of the many languages. And so I landed there with 2 crates full of my stuff, microphones, tape recorders, and a fax machine, just to date how long ago this was. Sanger, do you know what a fax machine is?
I've heard of it.
Jeez. Oh God.
No, okay. I did send one fax one time in my life.
Yeah, just early email, I guess, is how you could think of it. And I just landed there, and it was just an assault on the senses, and this what's been called organized chaos, but seemed more chaotic than organized to me. And I just loved it. I loved the craziness of it. PJ O'Rourke, who was one of my heroes. He passed away recently, travel writer. And he said, if you're going to be a foreign correspondent, you want to go somewhere really effing foreign. And, where things are different, you don't want to go to Canada. So at least not your first posting. So I it's a love-hate relationship, and you'll see when you go to South Asia, nothing is easy. Everything's difficult. Everything's crowded and chaotic. But coming from sort of organized shopping mall America, I was in my element. I just ate that up.
Do you think places have a certain energy that draws human characteristics to those locations?
That's a good question. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and may tackle that a bit in my next book. So the Romans believed in something called a genius loci, which was the idea that every place had its spirit, the spirit of the place. And whether it was an intersection in the street or a house or a village or a town or a city or an empire, that it had its own energy. And today you do see certain places that claim to have lots of energy vortices. Sedona, Arizona comes to mind. And there are other places. I'm agnostic about that. I'm open to the possibility that there is actual physical energy that affects you in a place, draws you there. Could be, some effect from seismic energy. Like Iceland is a very seismically active place. And I've talked to Icelanders who say that affects you in some way. So I'm open to that possibility. I don't know for sure. My theory about why we feel different in different places is more that we give ourselves permission to be different people. You're leaving, you guys are in Dallas-Fort Worth area, right? So yeah, when you go to India, Nepal, Bhutan, you're gonna be away from all that. You're not going to be Sean from Dallas. You're going to be maybe a new Sean. So we also strip ourselves of all the clutter of our lives. It's like instant curation. When you travel, you all of a sudden you got everything you can fit in a suitcase or two. And so it's actually this streamlining and this permission that you would give ourselves to be in different places, I think, is one of the big reasons why we feel differently in different places.
Did you notice that change in yourself when you went to South Asia for the first time?
I did. I mean, first of all, I found myself a lot more aware of my surroundings and observant. Now, you could be just as observant, in Dallas or in Baltimore. But when you travel, you're tricking your mind and saying, oh, this is all new. I better pay attention. And I'm only going to be here for a week or 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it is. There's some travelers who try to bring that home and do an experiment. You can try it where you just wake up tomorrow, pretend you're a tourist in your hometown. You're only there for a few days and just observe the way you observe it, the way you would. But I mean, at the time in India, there were no cell phones, no internet, no ATMs. I mean, no American fast food. As I explained it, when you were outside of India, you couldn't imagine being there. When you were in India, you couldn't imagine anything outside of it. It was its own sort of universe. And I did. I found it incredibly liberating.
I find that. So my dad, anytime he would go through troubles in life or business relationships, he would end up picking up and moving to Albuquerque.
You mean like he moved there more than once?
Oh yeah, he's
moved there like multiple times.
3 or 4 times he's moved to Albuquerque, and then he'd move back, and it disrupted my life quite a bit.
I can imagine. Yes.
Yeah, but I'm like, well, there must be something about this place, and if you look at places that become fountains for artistic expression or scientific exploration or happiness or peacefulness or whatever it is, I think there are human characteristics that spring forth from certain locations.
So there's this notion of thin places. Have you heard of that?
No.
So thin places, and this was the article I mentioned earlier that I wrote for the New York Times that AI kind of ripped off. But thin places, it's an old Celtic or Irish notion that heaven and earth are actually closer than we think. But in thin places, they're just 3 inches apart. And the idea is that there's a transcendent quality to these places. You can sort of see it in the foggy, misty Irish countryside. But in this article, I took the idea further and suggested it could be your favorite coffee shop or bookstore or Albuquerque, right? Some place where you feel closer to, you can call it heaven, you can call it the other, just something outside of your normal waking self. And I think that's what your father may have been experiencing, because, of course, Georgia O'Keeffe moved to New Mexico to do her painting. D.H. Lawrence, the English poet, moved to New Mexico being about as far away from the English countryside in every way that you can get. There is something about the expansiveness of, I think, the big sky of a place like that. It's not for everyone. You know, in my book, Ben and Me, I write about a term I invented called soul places, which is the idea that just as each of us have a soul, we have a soulmate. You could have many people you like, but, you know, only one soulmate. I think each of us has a soul place. You know, for me, it is India. For your father, it clearly was Albuquerque, you know, but someplace you keep returning to. For Benjamin Franklin, it was Philadelphia. So, yeah, I think there's something to it. I don't know why he kept leaving Albuquerque, though. Once he went there, that's a whole nother story.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. You know, what's funny is that Sanger and I just 2 days ago and there must have been some energy telling me to do this. Sanger and I were in Washington, D.C. 2 days ago, and we went only for the day. And I only took...
Which, by the way, not the way to travel.
No.
It's an ass beating of a day. Yes, it was.
Yeah, when you say only for
fly there and come
that's
back
not my philosophy of travel.
Right.
There's a whole slow travel movement we can get into. And you were not practicing slow travel, but go ahead.
No. So we go and come back on the same day. And I only take 2 pictures on my phone in Washington, D.C. One is Sanger sort of flipping off the IRS building. I thought was funny. And the other, because I had not even connected it consciously that we were going to be talking today, is a picture of Ben Franklin, the statue of Ben Franklin. And so there must have been something to it about us connecting today.
There are no coincidences.
There are no coincidences. Yeah. So we traveled up and back the same day. And I had never done this before, to travel with nothing. Right, we had no suitcases, we had no backpacks, I had no briefcase. I didn't.
Literally nothing. Like
literally nothing.
Wow. Did you feel naked or something?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. I kept sort of tapping my pockets.
If we had not been dressed well, we would have gotten a lot more negative attention.
Right. You need at least a backpack or a
we stood
briefcase.
Out pretty significantly.
But I thought about that because that was a unique experience. And so it made me contemplative about that whole trip. I thought, you know, anytime you travel, you're leaving a lot behind. And I think the more you can consciously do that and seek out what it is that the place you're going has to teach you, the more open to that curiosity you can be.
I thoroughly agree with that. And it starts with the physical, like physically leaving things behind. You know, I find I have too many books at home. I can never decide which one to read. But, you know, on the road, I bring fewer, still too many, my wife tells me, to be traveling with. All of a sudden, your choices, we're talking about decision-making here, are curated for you. They're narrowed down. And your choices of what to do any particular day are kind of narrowed down. And literally, like, what's in front of you, you know, even the worst hotel room is still going to be less cluttered than your living room or your home office back home. And that's one reason I like hotel rooms, is because it's just, I feel I can think in them, you know. And some writers do. You know, J.K. Rowling wrote the last Harry Potter book at, like, the fanciest, most expensive hotel in Edinburgh, Scotland, like a suite for $5,000 a night or more. And she wrote in the hotel that way. I feel too much pressure with the meter running at that rate, you know, to write. But yeah, you it's what you leave behind physically, and it's what you leave behind about these preconceived notions about yourself, or about yourself, or about the way things are. So this is my theory is that people who, when we say, or think that's just the way things are, really what we mean is that's just the way things are here at this time and place. And then, we're like a fish in a fishbowl. The fish does not know it's in a fishbowl unless you take it out of the fishbowl. And then it will maybe you drop it in another fishbowl and it would see things more clearly. And the fun part is you put it back in its original fishbowl and it has a greater, I guess, appreciation or acknowledgement of that original fishbowl. And the sort of human travel version of this is if you go out of the country in particular for a fairly extended period of time and then you come home, you start to notice things about the United States, about Dallas or Baltimore, whatever it is. And, for me living in India, a year or two would go by before I'd come home, and then I'd come back and go to a Whole Foods, which was relatively new back then. And I was just paralyzed by indecisiveness because there were so many breakfast cereals and so many types of bread and all this abundance that, did not exist in India, that no matter how much money you have, you could not get a bottle of wine or French cheese back then.
Yeah, one of the things that I notice the most when I travel is you notice the extreme beauty and the extreme, ugly. Like, oh, that mountain is gorgeous. Now that stands out to me a lot. We don't have mountains here. Or a beach. Oh, this beach is beautiful. We don't have beaches in Fort Worth. Or the building is really pretty and nice. But then I'll notice the really run-down, ugly area with graffiti on the wall. There's litter everywhere that they haven't picked up. It feels unsafe. And I feel very unsafe.
Partly because, why do you think that is?
Because it's different. I don't actually know how unsafe it is.
I mean, I'm sure there are unsafe parts of Dallas-Fort Worth area, but you know them. And you know if you're there or you're not there. It's this lack of knowledge of the terrain, I think, in a new place. But I think it's terms of, yes, acknowledge and notice the beauty, obviously, but also acknowledge and notice the ugliness and the dirt. I think we don't, travel writers or who travelers don't do anyone any favors by pretending every place is 100% beautiful, or that every place is equally beautiful. We have opinions about places just like we have opinions about people.
Yeah. They're colored by our experience with that place, just like our opinion of a person is colored by our experience of a person. You hear like when the Me Too movement and people would be like, well, he never did anything to me. Like they have a hard time believing this guy might be a bad guy.
Right.
Because in their experience with him, it wasn't bad. It's like, well, that neighborhood's actually not that bad. I've never been robbed.
Well, experience is, and Benjamin Franklin was a big believer in learning through experience, but he was also always open to the possibility of changing his mind about those experiences. You can, and you're right, like just one experience doesn't mean it's true for everyone, because how do we know about a country? We know when we experience it, when we go there, but we also know the stereotypes in our mind. We know what we may or may not have read about it. That's why when I go to a new place, and if I'm writing about it, I'll read the history because I can't go back in time otherwise, but I won't read other contemporary accounts about, say, Brazil or wherever it is I'm going for a first time, because I want to have that freshness. You only get one chance to be in a place for the first time. And that's why I teach a bit of travel writing, and I always tell people, prepare, but don't over prepare for a trip. Like leave something open to surprise, to be surprised.
It seems cliche. There's always this sort of story of the young man who goes off to India or Nepal or something to find himself. And I always wondered, well, why do you have to travel halfway around the world to have that sort of experience? What are you running from? What are you running to? But is being in a different place allow you to open up your mind to those experiences in a different way that you just can't in a familiar place?
So the American writer from the mid-20th century, Henry Miller, said something that I just love, and I think it describes my philosophy about this. He said, one's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things. And That is what it's all about. I also believe there's nothing wrong with running away from things if they're bad things. You should run away from them, abusive childhood or relationship. So yeah, sometimes you travel, people are like, what are you running away from? I'm running away from a crappy situation. Okay. But then you should have to be running towards something too. And that's something you may not know. It's David Eagleman, I think he's from Texas. He's a neuroscientist, and he came up with this phrase of being a possibilian. A possibilian is open to the prospect of possibility. Is there life on another planet? And he's like, I don't know, but I'm a possibilian. And I think when you travel, you have to be a possibilian also. You have to be open to that possibility. If you know exactly what you're going to a place for, don't go. There has to be an element of uncertainty. It's also why I don't overplan a trip. And I don't, you don't want to, we have enough preconceived notions in our mind already. You don't want to say, I'm going to India to achieve spiritual, bliss. No, you may or may not experience that.
Did you find a higher number of people who had experienced spiritual bliss in that area? And if so, what were they doing in common that was allowing them to experience it?
I mean, you meet people on what used to be called the hippie trail, that part of the world, who are in a state of crisis sometimes, again, running away from something, or they feeling lost. So I think they're more receptive to a spiritual experience because they've had their core shaken, and a lot of spiritual traditions, they believe that is a prerequisite for having a spiritual breakthrough, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, is to be shaken out of your ordinary existence. If you're just humming along and everything's fine and you don't have a care in the world, you're unlikely to have this experience of awe or of, spiritual breakthrough because things are fine. And that's okay. But it's, whether it was Jesus, Muhammad, or whoever, things were not fine for them. So, there's that old saying that, the crack, you need the cracks because the cracks are how the light gets in. So that's what we're talking about here.
What drew you to your work on exploring Ben Franklin?
That's a good question, because a number of readers have said, well, that's not a typical topic for you. You read about foreign places and foreign peoples, about Gandhi, Confucius, Socrates. And on the one hand, that's true. I'll be honest, we were sitting in the middle or the tail end of the pandemic, and I couldn't travel that much. I was going back and forth with my editor about book ideas. And he didn't like my idea, so he came to me and said, well, why don't you write a book on UFOs? I think that would be good. There's a lot of interest in UFOs. And I really did not want to write a book on UFOs, but I really did want to keep my editor happy. So I started to look into it. And the more I looked into it, the more I became absolutely certain I did not want to write a book on UFOs. But I stumbled across this article from Salon Magazine titled, Our Founding Fathers Alien Obsessed. I'm like, what? And it turns out a number of the founders had sort of encounters of lights in the sky. In fact, a number of them explicitly in their writing said they believed in a multiplicity of worlds, of intelligent life out in the universe, talking 18th century. And one of those people was Benjamin Franklin. Started to read about him, started to read about his 13 virtues, and quickly realized there was a lot more to him than this cartoonish image we have of, Ben flying a kite or Ben flirting with the ladies of France, both of which are true. But, and I also realized I had this hole in my knowledge. Like I was so enamored of international locations and foreign sources of wisdom. I just, didn't pay attention in high school history class and didn't know much about my country. And I thought, well, that's got to change. And especially because Ben Franklin, I call him the least dead of the founders. He's the most accessible. He would definitely have his own podcast and probably a Substack if he came back today. If he didn't, if he would have a pair of noise canceling headphones on, if they didn't exist, he'd probably invent noise canceling headphones. So he's the least dead of the founders, but he's also sort of the most relevant, I think, when it comes to, improving your life, which is what really all my writing is about, being better, happier people. And Franklin, I discovered, was very much interested in that. It wasn't just all electricity and signing Declaration of Independence and all that.
What was the most surprising thing that you learned about him?
Oh boy. How old he was when he did all this stuff would be one thing, you know. He did his kite experiments. He was in his 40s, but he didn't become a rebel and, you know, join the rebel cause until he was at 69 years old. You know, he's off in France representing the U.S. and he's in his 70s. Constitutional Convention, he's 81, Joe Biden's age, you know, he's old enough to be the grandfather of most of the other delegates. And not just that he was old when he did this, but he was nimble, and he had a willingness to change his mind about important things. Most of us, as we get older, we get sort of more set in our ways. Sanger, maybe you know someone like that. Sean, maybe you're someone like that. I don't know. But you guys have a father-son team. You must obviously get along. But in some ways, we get like more, you know, we like it this way. This is my coffee. I like, you know, it's got to be medium dark roast, not medium, and, you know, and we get set in our ways. And Franklin did not, you know, about the small stuff and about the big stuff. He changed his mind about slavery, about democracy. I think that was surprising and inspiring as well.
How did he change his mind about democracy?
Well, he was a loyal subject of King George III, and thought that this fine, noble vase, he called it, the British Empire, must be kept intact. He, you know, in 1760s, he's saying that it's not only implausible, it's impossible the American colonies would ever split from the British. And through his experience, he lived in London for a long time, and he was talked down to in a lot of ways by the British, who, don't forget, Franklin only had 2 years education, right? And he's an American from the rough part of the colonies there. And so they looked down at him, not all of them, but some of them did. And I think it wore him down. And there were some key moments in the history where he's like, that's it. I'm changing my mind. It's like that character in one of the Hemingway books where he says, well, how'd you go bankrupt? Well, 2 ways, very slowly and then very quickly. And sometimes that's the way these big decisions are made. It's not like a steady pace. It's like slow drip, drip, drip. And then all of a sudden, boom, the floodgates open.
I thought his foresight was interesting. I was reading something recently that there was just a trust in Philadelphia that became available to the city of Philadelphia.
Yeah, right. Philadelphia and Boston.
$100 million or something.
Yeah, lots of. So he started it. It was in his will. So he died in 1790, 84 years old. And in his will, he sets up this trust, and it's going to, and I'm getting to the business stuff where if I make a mistake, let me know. But the interest is compounding and it's building up, and you're not supposed to touch it for 200 years. It was for working class people in Philadelphia, and also his birthplace, the city of Boston. And it just came to maturity, I guess is the term, in 1990, 200 years later. And Franklin had predicted fairly accurately, pretty darn close, how much it would be worth, 200 years later. So he was useful even after death. And that's pretty farsighted, I would say.
You had mentioned, I think 13 principles or 13 virtues. What, you don't have to go through all of them, but what of those?
What's the significance of those?
So Franklin's in his 20s, and he's living in Philadelphia, and he's, realizes he's got to get his shit together. I don't know if I can say that in this podcast, but I just did. He's got to get his stuff together, and he says, he was very big on plans and planners and sketching out his day, and he sketched out his day hour by hour. He's like, I need to come up with some guideposts. And virtues back then, I should say, did not have this sort of almost, for some people at least, the sanctimonious air today, like, oh, you're so virtuous, or you're virtue signaling. Like back then, virtue was synonymous with character, and it was not a controversial thing at all. So he's like, I need to come up with a list, and I'm going to follow them. And he came up with 12 originally, the first one being temperance. He figured if he was totally drunk, he couldn't observe the others. Industry, frugality, cleanliness, silence, honesty of a kind, like tell no hurtful deceits. He doesn't say tell no deceits, tell no hurtful deceits. Comes up with 12, presents them to a Quaker friend of his in Philadelphia, and friend says, well, it's pretty good, Ben, but, you know, you can be kind of arrogant. I think you should add humility to there. He's like, oh, okay, so I'll add humility. And then he's got 13. And his plan was to write them in a notebook. 13 times 4 is 52. So 4 weeks for each virtue, add up to a year. He's going to work on one for 4 weeks. And anytime he strays from it, he carries a little notebook around with him all day, like honesty. You know, if he strays from that, he's going to put a X mark. And he thought this would be easy. He thought, I know what it means to be a good person. This shouldn't be a problem. There were so many black X marks in that notebook that he had to switch to pencil instead of pen and a different notebook. And he realized it was harder than he thought. So on the one hand, the experiment failed. He did not achieve moral perfection, which was his goal, but he did say he bettered his hand, like some calligrapher copying the masters. They'll never be as good as the masters, but they will better their hand. And yeah, I mean, it was things like that I think make him absolutely relevant today.
Yeah, it moved from an experiment of sort of moral perfection to one of self-awareness, I guess. That's where he succeeded in becoming pretty self-aware and checking off these violations to his own.
Right. And he was willing, you know, unlike the other founders who, you know, the tell-all memoir didn't exist yet. Everyone would try to hide their flaws and try to be perfect. Maybe that still exists today. He's willing in writing, we know that about the experiment from his autobiography, he's willing to admit, I wasn't perfect and I got things wrong. You know, he didn't reveal everything about his imperfections, but he revealed some. And, you know, I think that's valuable. I try to do it in my writing, use self-deprecating humor and to, you know, no one wants to learn, no one will learn from a perfection, someone who's absolutely perfect. You know, it's easier to learn from a flawed individual like yourself, I think.
Yeah, and there's something relatable when somebody's open about their flaws. Like, oh, okay, finally, I can trust that the good things about this person are real because they're open about the bad things.
Yeah, I describe it as reaching out a hand to the reader in the case of my books. And I've written, you know, in bits and pieces in my various books about my struggle with depression and anxiety. And it feels good to write it. And it feels even better when I go to give a talk somewhere and someone will come up and say, I've struggled with panic attacks or whatever it is. And I just want to thank you for writing this. Yeah, so that is gratifying.
He must have been held in really, really high esteem by the other founding fathers of the time in order for these caricatures to kind of, he's the most famous non-president of that time.
He is, and he's the only one of the founding fathers who would have been famous even if there was not an American Revolution. By that, I mean George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. They're famous because of their role in the American Revolution. Franklin was already famous. Don't forget, he's a generation older than them. He's already famous for his electrical experiments in the 1750s, 25 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, et cetera. So he would have been famous anyway. Now, did they respect him? Some did, not all. I mean, he famously butted heads with John Adams. There's a famous, it's not famous, but it's a quite telling scene. And I love this one where Adams and Franklin are forced to share a hotel room somewhere in New Jersey because there's just not enough rooms at this inn. This is like 1775, 76. And the way Adams describes it is they get into a fight over whether the window should be opened or closed. Now, Adams believed, as most people did at the time, that fresh air was bad. You should always close the window, keep the fresh air out. Franklin, as usual, ahead of his time, recognized that fresh air was good and should be open. And they're just going back and forth. No, open, close. No, you open it, you close. And it's a great description because it sort of humanizes them. But Franklin and Adams did not get along because Adams was this very well-educated, John Adams, very well-educated teacher, bit of a snob, prickly. And for instance, they're both serving in France. They're trying to, get the French to support the Americans during the war. And Franklin's like waking up at 11 a.m., at noon. He's conducting his business in the evenings and dinner parties and salons and Adams just thought he was reprobate, flirting with the ladies, drinking all that wine and, not waking up early. But in fact, Franklin was meeting the French on their terms, I think.
That's interesting. I love hearing stories about like the fresh air, good versus bad, because we hear that and go, what an idiot. Like, why would you think that outside air is bad?
Well, just think, I'm sure there are things that we think, all three of us here, and that
is raw milk good? Is raw milk bad?
I remember 100, 200 years from now, it might even be something that we just assume is good. How could it be bad? And, 100, 200 years from now, they'll think we're idiots. So,
and who knows what those things are going to be.
Exactly.
That people 200 years from now don't even have to think about. They don't even have to see a study that shows that that's bad. They just go intuitively, oh, they were doing that? They put their phones in the front pocket? I don't know, whatever.
That's a good one. It could be that. Everyone knows that causes cancer or whatever. Why would they do that? The back pocket's fine. Yeah.
You got that thick butt to keep you safe,
Yeah.
Front, it's all types of problems.
Exactly.
What stuck out to you the most from those virtues for you personally? What resonated with you?
Well, so I tried an experiment because my books, I try to be interactive. I'm not just writing about Franklin. This is I'm engaging with him. So I tried the silence one. That doesn't mean being completely silent, but Franklin advocated, if you don't have something important to say or useful to say, just be quiet and listen. And my wife and daughter always complained that I talk too much. And so they were all on board on me trying this experiment. I actually got I don't have it right in front of me now, but the same kind of a modern day model of what the kind of notebook Franklin used. I got it from a website called The Art of Manliness. And it's like leather bound. It's way cool. And I love a good notebook or planner. So I definitely got that. And I'm going to go around and mark any time that I veer from this virtue of silence. And I think I made it 2 or 3 days, before the experiment came crashing to a close. And so in that sense of failure, but also I was aware and I was aware when, not only how much I can overtalk, but when I would over-talking is talking over much. That's what Franklin called it. You shouldn't be talking over much. And I would do it when I was anxious or, at a party where I don't know people. Some people get quiet. I'll just start blabbering nonsense, And so I became aware of the extent of this, how much I had to work on this virtue and also when I veered from it. So again, valuable in that sense.
I have found that, and I find it really difficult, that silence part. Certainly the talking part. I'll talk a lot, and I'm working on that. But I have found that it's difficult for me to remain in silence, in my own head. So if I'm hiking, I have to be listening to something. If I'm running, I have to be listening to music or listening to a podcast.
And it's available now thanks to technology.
Yeah, it's so easy. So I bought my wife bought me a dry sauna. And so I turned it up to 180, 200 degrees, sit in there for 15, 20 minutes. And I've only had it 4 days, running 4 days. And so I thought, this will be a good time to sit in silence for 15 minutes and meditate on what I'm grateful for.
Also because any electronics you bring in might melt, right?
Well, that's true.
Right.
And so my phone is outside. I can see it through, the window and a little timer. And so I set the phone outside and I sit there for 15 minutes. I was like, oh, okay. I don't know what I don't know what I'm going to think about. So I really thought about what I was going to think about the next time I did it. And I was very, very thoughtful. I was like, all right, I'm going to go through those 4 steps, right? And pray and meditate about these 4 things. And I did it. I did it again. And the 4th time I said, I'm not doing this. I put my earpods in. I listened to a podcast.
Oh, I gave up.
I gave up. So it is so difficult for me to remain in silence.
Well, that's what makes it good.
I know. I taught myself.
Yeah. And I think that's partly human nature. I think it was Blaise Pascal back in the 16th century who said, all of human evil can be traced to the fact that of man's inability to sit alone in a room by himself quietly, right? We need to fill it up with something. Partly it's human nature. Partly it is exacerbated, definitely amplified by modern technology, because we always have something to create some noise in our head. Might be valuable. You might be listening to the best audiobook, the best podcast, but you might be listening to crap too, just to fill up the time. Even sitting on the toilet isn't as, people tend to bring their devices then as well. So there's, I think, a price to be paid for not sitting with discomfort, silence, uncertainty. It's another thing that we run away from faster than I think people did in the past.
Yeah, Michael Easter has a great book about called The Comfort Crisis, about that we have too much of that where it's easy. It's easy to not sit in silence, so we don't. It's easy to eat food and not be hungry, so we eat food. It's easy to drive over there, so we don't walk.
There's a convenience tax, basically. I think anything that's convenient comes with a tax in a way, a sort of psychic tax.
Yeah. Final question. What is your top decision-making tip for business owners?
I should say you are asking an indecisive person, but I will tell you a story. Can I tell a quick story?
Yeah, sure.
So I am a pescatarian. I have not had fish and vegetables. I have not had meat for 40 years. And it's not on philosophical grounds or religious grounds. It's on decision-making grounds because I'm indecisive. I was living in India, had a bad experience with meat. Don't want to talk about it, but I said, there's so much vegetarianism there. I'm going to only eat vegetables, and I love sushi, so I'm going to add fish to it. I'm going to be a pescatarian. And now I find when I go into a restaurant and all the other people I'm with are struggling over the 27,000 choices on the menu, I can narrow it down to what are the vegetarian dishes? What are the seafood dishes? I just don't look at the chicken or the beef. I don't have to look at it. So I think limiting your choices, it helps you to make decisions. The rule of 3 is a good one. My friend Steve, fellow journalist and writer, used to work when he was young in college at a shoe store. He said, never bring a customer more than 3 pair of shoes. The 4th one sends you over the edge. 2 is not enough. We need 3 choices. So I think if you can limit the choices to the number 3 is a good one, and just exclude everything else, you can wrestle with that. The French have an expression that translates to too many choices kill the choice. So we need to, when we sit down and really wrestle with the serious choices, we need to exclude the unserious ones.
Solid.
Thanks, Eric. Where can people connect with you and get a copy of the book?
Well, book anywhere. 5 of my books are available at your local bookstore. Local bookstores are great. There is apparently a large corporation that will send you books in 2 days. I've heard about this. You can go to that large corporation and they'll send you the book. Also, I have a website, ericweinerbooks.com, all one word. I'm on X, I'm on Instagram. And a quick plug, if you don't mind, I run a writing and well-being workshop in Bhutan because, Sean, you mentioned you're going there. I run these every year. The next trip is coming up April 28th to May 8th. It's 10 days of seeing this amazing country And also working on some beginning writing practices or journaling, keeping a diary, very basic stuff like that. And I've been doing it for a number of years. It's an amazing trip. You can find out more on my website or going to Himalayan Writers Workshop.
Coincidentally, that's when I'm going to be there. So maybe I'll stop by and
Look at that.
say hi.
Okay. I know a lot of people there. I can introduce you to some
I'll
and
connect with you.
We'll connect. Small world.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Eric.
Thank you. This was great.
My takeaway from talking to Eric is going to travel to places with an intentional curiosity. Is I really think there are cultures that have certain attributes in certain places, and just say, all right, what am I expecting to find there, and looking for the reasons. Why are there a lot of artists here? What is it about? Is it the environment, the scenery? Or a lot of people seem happy here because whatever reason, and going there searching out, what do I expect that I will find, and having open eyes and a curious soul to seek that out when you travel.
My big takeaway is limiting choices. He was talking about being pescatarian allowed him to minimize the choices on a menu at a restaurant. And I do something similar. I don't like to read the menus, and I kind of just will pick usually what somebody at the table picks or what the waiter recommends. And there's other ways in business to do that. And saying, hey, we don't offer these services, we don't offer these products, or we have a framework that everything that we do has to fit in. So if a new idea doesn't fit in the framework, even if it sounds exciting and it's cost effective, we're not even going to entertain it. So I think there's still work that I can do in life and in business to limit choices or to kind of put up litmus tests for choices that will allow decision making to be easier and quicker.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show and leaving us a review wherever you're listening. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Sean's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.